when you were looking before at the uh, poster that Ben Uri placed before you, you saw on the one hand this notion, immigrants and their art since 1900, celebrating their contribution to the visual arts. And you also saw a painting which is in the possession of Ben Uri, a very interesting painting which we will relate to later. But you can understand that this individual that you see in front of you, in one of the several self-portraits that he did, was not always a very happy individual. He was born in 1865. At some point, he has some ailment, and he dies young at 1908 after having moved to different places. Eventually, in 1907, he moves to Jerusalem to teach at the Bezalel Institute. And then a year later, he passes away. Hirszenberg has interested us also because this is a person who gives us an example of the problems that an immigrant artist has as he moves away from his home where he came from in Lodz, and he moves elsewhere. And he also faces a lot of different changes in the society in which he's living. He also comes into contact with a world of different individuals, Jews, non-Jews, people whom he likes and people who he finds difficult to work with. And he's also in a city which is going through a tremendous transformation. And in a sense, what brought Miriam and I together was the fact that here we have a man who's going through this period of turmoil, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, but his encounter with different worlds of art and with different worlds of ideologies, he is a man who really deserves serious attention. And we've tried to do this in our book over the years that we've worked on it. And you will see some of the contribution which he's made to modern art, not only to Jewish art, but to modern art in general. And maybe we would see the painting which has become, in a way, identified with Hirszenberg. And this is his Exile. Now, this painting was begun in Lodz in 1899. He finishes it in Krakow in 1904. The painting, unfortunately, is lost. It was last seen in Germany in 1938, and though people have searched for it, they've never been able to find it. And in a sense, you can say that in this painting, Hirszenberg brings together a wide assembly of Jews of different orientation, some who are Orthodox, some who are conservative, some who are very different in terms of their ideologies. And if you look at just at the hats on these individuals, you can see they're coming from different areas. We don't know where they're going, but they're going in the cold. In a sense, this is representative of the movement of the migration which is going on from Eastern Europe elsewhere. As we all know, in this period from 1890 to 1910, there's a tremendous emigration from Eastern Europe to the New World and also to Palestine and to other places. And the Exile really brings together some of the issues which Hirszenberg is confronting with over the years, and that is the turmoil which Eastern European Jews are undergoing at that period. And coming from where he comes, from a city, which is a city going through tremendous change, and already you can see something in this postcard that you saw in the front poster, where you saw the Sabbath rest. You saw maybe something from the windows, but here you can see what is happening in this city in the second half of the 19th century. It becomes a city of textiles and factories, and Hirszenberg's family, his parents, his father works in one of these factories, does not make much living, and though they have a very large family, Samuel and Samuel's parents, who here look maybe quite elegant, but clearly their situation was not an elegant one, as we have from various documentation. And so at some point, Samuel leaves Lodz, goes to study in Krakow, and there he encounters the great leader of Krakow art at that time, of Polish art. And Miriam will clearly say something about the man that you see in front of you.
Okay, so let me just go back a little bit to the aims of our book and the reason why we are going now to see also different kinds of art that is usually not known and not connected to Hirszenberg's oeuvre. We decided to discover or rediscover Hirszenberg because he was mainly known to researchers of Jewish art due to his Jewish topics and Jewish paintings like the one we just saw, Exile or Galut. But we started to be aware that actually there was a long artistic career that he had before he arrived to Jerusalem and before he became famous through Jewish journals that published the reproductions of his work. And we decided to go in his footsteps. So in order to learn about the art that he created as a young man, the first stop was really Krakow, because he studied there at the School of Art headed by Jan Matejko, who was one of the famous, or most famous probably at his time, Polish artists that specialized in large historic canvases. And for us, it's even more important that he was teacher of Maurycy Gottlieb, another famous Polish artist who preceded Hirszenberg and in a way gave an example and encouraged probably Hirszenberg to follow his path. Hirszenberg could have seen, we're not sure, but could have seen retrospective of Gottlieb still in Warsaw and maybe decided that this will be also his path, and therefore came to Krakow, to the same place where Gottlieb studied. And once we started to research more about Krakow and his early days as a student, we were lucky to discover this really very special item, which is artist's sketchbook that was preserved for many years at Tel Aviv Graphic Department, at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art and Graphic Department. It was given to the department by his youngest brother, Heinrich Hirszenberg, and totally forgotten. Nobody ever published it or looked into it. And we came really just by chance to that special preserved item of Hirszenberg. And what I'm showing you here is schedule of his studies, which is really very, very unusual and very special that we can discover in general about artists such early path in his development. And we could see from it that he left the religious way of life. We know this also from the memoirs of his wife, Dina, that I'm sure Richie will later mention more in detail. He was asked by his father to put the tefillin on and continue praying and continue preserving the religious kind of life that he grew up at his family. But we see from this schedule that he actually studied on Saturday. And among the subjects that he was studying, it was already French language, probably with the thought that he might end up in Paris, which he really did later. He was interested in chess and in physical education on top of all the other art classes that he was taking. On top of it, we can see on the right side his early trying of developing a signature that first he was copying Matejko's signature, hopefully also afterwards thinking of one day becoming famous as his teacher and developing his own signature on the painting. So such a notebook is really of great value, especially so that he drew in it many drawings and sketches that later he developed as paintings in later period in Lodz and in Munich, where he lived, and the sketchbook accompanied him for a number of years. Here we visited Krakow in, as you see, 2012, and tried to juxtapose the sketches from his notebook with the sights of Krakow that we saw ourselves. In a school, he befriended Polish artists, especially Marian Wawrzyniecki, that's his contemporary symbolist artist, and they explored Krakow together and drew together, both of them also Jewish sites and Christian sites. And among Jewish sites was a famous graveyard in Krakow that was afterwards, as we will see later, used by Hirszenberg as a sketch for his famous painting, Jewish Cemetery. He also sketched a number of Jewish types that later we will see in his oil paintings. And in general, this early sketchbook became one of sources and inspiration for his later art. And in it, we can see different subjects that he tackled afterwards as well. He studied in Krakow just for 2 years, feeling soon that he learned everything what there was to learn from Matejko. And in 83, he moved to Munich and continued his studies there at the Munich Academy and took his notebook with him. And here we can see that he started to read avidly Jewish history. He read a number of Jewish books, historians dealing with the history of Spain and Portugal and Poland and Germany. Of course, Heinrich Graetz is among the most famous one, but also the others. And he was copying very carefully the titles of the books that he wanted to read or maybe read already. And they inspired him to think about different historical subjects that he jotted down and also gave the titles for different paintings in this notebook that it seems he never painted, or we didn't find any of those. But it's interesting that this early phase was still connected to historical painting, at least judging the titles that he was giving, and probably influenced by his teacher, Matejko. But then came a break, and he painted the first famous painting that Richie will tell us more about. It was Yeshiva, or School of Talmudists, that was exhibited at 1887 in Munich and afterwards in Krakow. And actually, thanks to this painting, Hirszenberg became famous.
In a sense, this is not his, it's not his first work, but it's clearly it's one of his most important early works. And already in this work, we see that he is dealing with Jewish tradition, but he's dealing with Jewish tradition in a complicated way. We made great effort, and we were helped by people in the Krakow Museum to see maybe what is written on the back, which is scratched out. But if you look carefully at what you see here, these 5 men sitting at the table, they've maybe studied the whole night. There's not anybody who's really very much involved in the study. And the teacher, who you can see, who is sitting on the right, holding his head with his hand, the large manuscript, large printed book which is open is probably the Talmud. But you can't quite see that below that he's holding another book, probably a book which is not appropriate for a person who's teaching in a yeshiva. And so we have here 5 different figures. A young boy has already fallen asleep. the one with his back to the wall, is clearly not very interested in what's happening, and he has a clear critical view of maybe the only one who continues to try to study. And so in a sense, one can see that already in 1887, as we will see in a moment in another work, Hirszenberg is dealing with his Jewish tradition, and then he goes like Gottlieb, and he goes to the person who the 19th century Jewish artists of Jewish origin are very, very engaged in, and that is, of course, Benedictus Spinoza. As you all know, Spinoza, who was excommunicated in the 17th century, has a real continuous engagement with artists, with writers, with philosophers, especially in the 19th and the 20th century. And once again, we can see that Spinoza continues to be a very important figure for scholars of Judaica. And here we see him bringing together Spinoza, sitting on the lap of another banished Jew, Uriel da Costa, who lived before him. And in a way, what Hirszenberg has done in this unfortunately lost painting, he has the very, very strong looking Uriel da Costa, almost as if he fears what he sees. And yet he has this very lovely young child sitting on his lap with blonde hair, almost the kind of sense of the future. And I would think that already at this period in his life, Hirszenberg is saying, I see myself as being part of this tradition of people who came from the Jewish tradition, from the Orthodox tradition, and who now are no longer part of it. And what Miriam has brought together in the showing another side, and that is, of course, a painting which obviously I think Hirszenberg had seen, and that is Gottlieb's portrayal of Uriel da Costa with his lover, Judith van der Straten. And in a sense, you can say that what he has done here is he put them in a much less attractive scene. And we will see that he never really leaves this identification with Spinoza. He will come back to him almost in the end of his life in 1907 in a very important painting, which we'll show you later. So you can say that in the 1880s, Hirszenberg is both dealing with the past, he's dealing with his own sense of self, with whom does he identify? And then at some point, he leaves for a short period to Paris, and there we will see another side of this man, and we will see that he's not only engaged in his relationship to his Jewish tradition, but there's also an artistic world that he wants to identify with, as we see in the next image that Miriam will show you.
Okay.
This
So
is not the Jewish world.
Right. This came as a real surprise to us. We visited the professor Zagrodzki, Janusz Zagrodzki, who was the first researcher, Polish researcher of Hirszenberg. He wrote about Hirszenberg already in the 60s. And in his home, he had this painting, which is a small, wonderful, brilliantly colors, post-impressionist, impressionist painting with very, very free brushstrokes, and scene that Hirszenberg painted in one of the Parisian gardens. It happened in 1899 when he moved from Munich to Paris, accompanying his yeshiva painting, which was exhibited there on the international exhibition. And he came to study, to continue studying painting in Paris, probably, maybe, we don't know, with the plans to stay. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And after 10 months, he had to return to Lodz in order to help to his family who had severe financial problems. And he left this experiment behind, but it came really as a big surprise and we discovered entirely other side of Hirszenberg that is usually um, imagined as a Jewish artist painting in a dark tones, academic style. And suddenly we decided that there is also this other Hirszenberg that exists. And actually, as we went with him to Lodz, we saw that he didn't entirely forgot about this Parisian experiment. He did leave the brilliant colors and he adjusted to more conservative again environment that he returned to in Lodz, but he did continue painting landscapes, and landscapes became one of his important part of his oeuvre. So that means that in parallel to Jewish subjects and examining and reliving again and again um, Jewish life and reacting to it through paintings, he was also open towards landscape paintings and later, as we will see, also to portrait painting. And he preserved this very free brushstrokes and thick layers of color and free painting. These are not sketches, these are completed works that he painted while he was wandering in the outskirts of Lodz in nature, apparently because of his failing health. And he had health problems starting probably already from Munich times, where he was very often hungry and he developed stomach disease that accompanied him through his whole life. And it seems that he felt good while he was wandering and walking in nature, also trying to escape probably the overpopulated Lodz with a heavy industry and factories and smoke. And he felt good while he was walking in the little villages and towns around Lodz. And these are the paintings that he painted during his wanderings. Now, in the 90s, and we will come to this later while living in Lodz, he became attached to a number of industrialists and rich families that became his patrons, and they would invite him to paint at their summer houses. One of the places was called Lisovice, not far from Lodz, where he visited and painted during summer months as a guest of Sarah Poznansky, that we will hear later a little bit about. And we see that he actually returned to the same subject and the same scene from Paris, but again, much more tuned down, more conservative, also use of color and also composition, but still outdoors painting that he discovered with such a glamour while he was in Paris. But, and here we'll go back to Richie and George themes at the same time.
But I do think, Miriam, that we can't say that he was completely patronized by them. In other words, there were moments where they were willing to support him, but he was not an artist who had complete support by these wealthy families that had developed in Lodz. But what is very important to see in this first version of the Sabbath rest in 1890, we can see that we have a very similar scene which we're going to see in 1894. Family is sitting at the table. A young woman is standing at the window. This is a family scene. At some point, we know you can see from the window, you can see the factories, and it's clear that he is depicting something very close to what he has encountered when he comes back to Lodz, sees his family. His wife will later, Dina will later write about this painting as if it is letters from Argentina, that the young man who is reading these letters, in a sense, telling the family of those people who have left Łódź and gone to Argentina, part of the project of Baron de Hirsch, whose image appears on the wall. And you can see in this painting that there is no real great feeling of the Sabbath rest. If we had time, we could show you and compare this with the work by Moritz Oppenheim, 50 years, 60 years before, where there's a much more pleasant, warm, generous feeling. Here you sense that there's something very heavy in this atmosphere. No, aside from the young child who is leaning maybe on his grandfather, there's clearly a sense in which the Sabbath rest may be bringing some rest, but is not bringing anything very peaceful. And so the figure of that he's added in the Ben Uri version of the Sabbath rest with Baron de Hirsch on the wall, we can understand that Dina would later say, maybe these are letters from Argentina, that maybe this was the name that that Hirszenberg had given to the painting. But it's clear that in Łódź, as we can see in the next painting, we can see that he is confronted by what is happening within Jewish society. Here he's showing 3 women present in the Jewish cemetery in 1892, evoking a very deep feeling of turmoil, of tragedy, of loss. Though we can't pinpoint this to any particular event that was happening at that time. What is clear, though, is that the situation in Łódź was very difficult. Now, at some point, even though he goes back to Łódź, he does take trips to different places, and one place which he loved very much was Munich. And he goes back to Munich in 1896. It's in Munich that he meets his wife, who converts from Catholicism to Judaism. And though we do know that she is in Munich at that time, we don't know whether she converted or before she marries. She converted before she married Hirszenberg, but it's not clear if that was the reason why she converted, or she converted on her own. And she becomes a very important partner for him from 1896 until his death in 1908. Now, it's interesting if we look at this next painting, a very moving painting, which is an Ein Harod in Israel called The Last Jew. We're looking at a work which brings together something that we saw in some way in the yeshiva. We see an elderly man at the end of service. Some other person has simply left his prayer shawl on the table and left. And if we look carefully at this painting, what is this gentleman thinking? This is the same year that he does this painting, mostly in Munich and then in Łódź. He's looking at this candle. What is this candle signifying? There's a woman we can see her figure to the right of him in front. What is he thinking? Is he contemplating that he is the last Jew, that he has left the fold? I leave it to you to also think about this painting at the same time when he is so deeply engaged in dealing with his Jewish past, as you can see in the next painting, which is, of course, known to everybody, the Wandering Jew. Maybe, Miriam, you'll take over for a moment, and then we'll go back to exile, because I see that
Okay.
time is running away from us. Go ahead.
Okay. So I will just shortly summarize this amazing painting that is actually in Israel Museum, and it arrived with Hirszenberg to Bezalel, and it was exhibited in Hirszenberg's room at the Bezalel Museum, where Boris Schatz liked to take pictures next to it with the dignitaries, presenting it as Galut, as the diaspora, the hardships of diaspora and wandering Jew that escapes and runs through all these corpses and crosses behind him, and arrives finally to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel, and leaves this world behind him. The puzzling part of this story is that the painting was exhibited at the at the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1900, and Hirszenberg was painting it a year before in order to exhibit it there, and it received a bronze medal, which was always a question: what and how the committee that was composed of different artists from Russia and Poland, and also in France, French members that decided about this award to be given to Hirszenberg. What did they see in this painting? Because, of course, Schatz interpreted it from the Jewish side, but what did the non-Jews see in it? So we offered in one of the articles that we wrote different explanations. I'm not going to go through all of them, but in a way, it was a painting of doom. We're talking about the fin de siècle, the end of 19th century, approaching 20th century, and the fear of the new and the looking back in the past was also present in this painting, where the old man that runs is actually not dressed as a typically wandering Jew with a hat and a long coat and a cane, but rather looks like a Jesus that came down from the cross. So maybe this was something that the others saw, non-Jews saw in it, that Jesus came down and was horrified by what he saw was done in his name. So the painting was extremely important in Hirszenberg's work, and also got a lot of attention during his lifetime, both from Jews and non-Jews. What was interesting that he actually prepared the painting thinking that it will be exhibited together with other painting, the one that we already saw and talked about, Exile, and he thought of juxtaposing it, one showing contemporary immigrants, contemporary exiled Jews, and the other, this eternal wandering Jew. But it seems that he didn't manage to finish both paintings for the exhibition of 1900s, and he continued working on Exile later, and it was completed only in 1904. And I think Richie already told us enough about it, but I would just like to show one more detail, that he included here a portrait of his wife that he painted separately a year earlier, 1903. The painting also hangs nowadays at Ein Harod in Israel, at the Ein Harod Museum. And he included Dina among the exiled Jews, stressing her belonging and identification with Jewish destiny that she really also talks about and writes about in her memoirs, and presents herself as part of Jewish people.
You know, just maybe 2 words, Miriam, before you turn to Mrs. Zilberstein. When it was shown in 1938, the Jewish newspaper wrote about this painting, about these wanderers. And in a sense, when you look at this painting and you think of somebody showing this in 1938 in Berlin, at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, it had a very significant moment for them. And it's terribly unfortunate that we don't know what the colors were. This was shown in a Jewish exhibition in 1907. So we don't know what Hirszenberg wanted to do in terms of trying to bring color. There is nothing in this painting except for the young little girl holding the kettle, that there's a sign of some hope. And that is something which we will see maybe in some of the other works if we still have time. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Miriam. I know you want to talk about Mrs.
Okay, so let's now see again a different kind of Hirszenberg, different kind of work that he created. And again, at the same time, while he was working on Exile, he was actually commissioned by Poznański family to decorate the dining room in their mansion, in their palace. And I'm bringing here actually family members that were connected through marriages, that were all Hirszenberg patrons. They followed his work, bought his paintings from the very early years already in Munich, supported him financially, and eventually, as we will see now, commissioned these large works for Poznański's palace. So the main lady in this world was Teresa Silberstein, that was owner of summer house in Lisovice that I mentioned earlier, where he spent his summer months while he was living in Łódź and painting there. And her daughter was married to Maurycy Poznański and Sarah Salomea Poznański, born Silberstein, and they actually were, after death of Israel Poznański, who built this fantastic palace that stands today in Łódź, and it serves as a city museum. They commissioned Hirszenberg after their father's death to decorate the dining room, actually 2 rooms, only in dining room the paintings are still in situ left. And this was then entirely different kind of work that he created for this family of industrialists, one of the leading industrialists in textile industry that was strongly developed in Łódź, and Poznańskis were among the most famous and richest one, and were able to build such a big house palace that was influenced by Fontainebleau castle in France. And Poznańskis were imagining themselves as royalty, as aristocracy, and decorating in this vein also their rooms. And here we see this dining room with the paintings done by Hirszenberg still hanging on the walls. These are not murals, but actually paintings, oil paintings, painted on the canvases that were cut in the special shapes in order to fit into this stucco decoration that you see on the walls.
We should, of course, add that there is nothing in this room which would associate Hirszenberg to his Jewish interests. He had first, when they turned to him to do these works, he brought some images which appeared. Oh, you're going to show this. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead. You can talk about it.
You know, so in a sense, Hirszenberg had to redo in his mind what they wanted. They didn't want to have any associations which would be of a different nature. Hirszenberg was thinking of doing something where he was creating maybe images that had an association with the Bible, but the Poznański family, which was a very, very important family with huge factories of textile factories, they had no interest in doing it. And so what we are left with is a very interesting way in which Hirszenberg was able to depict, along with these very interesting sculptures that you see on the sides of the frescoes, that he was able to bring together what they wanted to show about the development of the of the Poznański family. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
The paintings that he painted for the palace were actually a result of his trips to Italy. And the question is whether this was expectation from the Poznański, from Maurycy Poznański, or this was suggestion later of Hirszenberg himself once his first sketches were rejected. But the current paintings that are symbolic in nature are actually based on trips that he did in Rome and surroundings of Rome. Like one of the paintings that is also belonging to this cycle inside the palace, actually depicts a town in Italy where he visited and painted. So it's probably painted there and then incorporated inside in the painting that it's supposed to show entrance, that's the title, entrance of Israel Poznański to Lodge as a young man who came and then succeeded in as a magnate in the industrial textile in Lodge. But actually, Hirszenberg painted here a Renaissance artist holding here a palette, riding on a horse, and arriving to Anticoli Corrado, which was a city in Italy beloved by painters, European painters who would come during the summers to paint there, especially using local models that were then incorporated in their paintings, sometimes even of religious subjects. And here, Hirszenberg's friend, a Polish artist called Edward Okun, whom he knew also from Lodge, and they worked together in a summer house of Sara Poznański in Lisovice. He also visited this town in Italy and painted a double portrait of himself and his wife, which probably then encouraged Hirszenberg to include also his wife, Dina, portrait of hers in, again, one of the paintings decorating this dining room in Poznański's palace. And we see her here as Fortuna, as the goddess Fortuna. But actually, if we compare to the later portrait that he did of Dina, we see that's the same woman appearing here. So in a way, he found a way to incorporate himself as an artist and her as Fortuna in this work that was otherwise commissioned and maybe also demanded in terms of subjects by his patrons.
And I think Dina would be very happy to know that she still is remembered. When you come to the museum in Łódź, you will see her because she was very dedicated to him. She remained very dedicated to him, and she wrote a very moving memorial about his life, and was very critical of the Poznańskis and others because they were not giving enough to her husband. And so at some point in 1904, Hirszenberg leaves Lodz. He goes with his parents and goes with Dina, comes into contact with a different world of Jews who were involved in cultural world in Krakow. He encounters Sholem Asch, as you see here, and he also meets a person who was very much engaged in assimilating and who was very critical of Jewish life, and that is the husband of Maria Feldman, who we see on the left. He also does a portrait of a fellow artist, and later in the 1930s, there'll be an exhibition of Abraham Neumann and Hirszenberg together. Both of them are not alive at that point. The Abraham Neumann painting is in the Israel Museum, and he does a painting of his doctor, who Dr. Schudmak, and that painting is in Krakow. And so you see here several interesting portraits which he did in the first decade of the 20th century. And then we go back to another aspect of his life, where we see in 1907,
Let
just
me
before, you want to say something more about the
yeah,
portraits?
I just want to add to this comeback to Krakow, that he actually was awaited there as already known artist, and he became center of a circle of young Jewish artists that met regularly in a cafe and discussed Jewish art with Hirszenberg, and planned different events like the exhibition and some public events. Even among them was Leopold Gottlieb, who was the youngest brother of Maurizi Gottlieb. And for a short period of time, there was a large activity. There was a very big activity around Hirszenberg, and Hirszenberg was considered the leader of that group. And then actually all these portraits also were painted, and all these people were interested in his art. They were buying them, buying his paintings or supporting him again, and writing about Jewish art in Polish and Jewish newspapers. So this was very short period of activity, but very interesting, and still not enough research. I think that even we didn't find yet enough material about this short period of time in Krakow. But the period ended very soon. By 1907, a lot of these artists left for Paris, while Hirszenberg decided to answer Schatz's invitation and come to Jerusalem. But before he left, he did another major work that again,
Very briefly, this painting, which is now in Russia, you see here maybe Hirszenberg thinking about what is it going to be to come to Palestine. Is he going to be coming to a very orthodox scene? And so here we have Leopold Gottlieb dressed as Spinoza, walking in the streets, creating a separation between 9 Jews who are frightened by the fact that this man is there. And then there's one Jew who is about to pick up a stone and throw it at Spinoza, and yet another who is maybe not quite sure whether he is with Spinoza or he's with the other 9. And in this sense, you can see how he is treating his position. He is trying to make a statement that I am with Spinoza. I identify with him. And in that sense, when we would look at another work where he criticizes these Jews who are standing and seemingly at a moment of prayer, but they're not really engaged in prayer. He's in a sense making fun of these people who are in the process of a certain Jewish tradition, which takes place on the first day of the new year, where they go to a place of water and symbolically unleash their sins by throwing them into the water. But you can see that these people are not really very much identified in what they're doing. And as time is running away from us, let's maybe move to Palestine and move to this very happy moment. Maybe we should leave this self-portrait and go to the photograph.
This is just the last portrait of them before leaving Europe. And I just juxtapose it to another Polish artist that was active at that time. But we can leave this for some other time, and let's arrive to Jerusalem.
This is Jerusalem, 1907. We see Hirszenberg sitting with Boris Schatz next to him. And then we see a very different Hirszenberg as he walks around the city, paints scenes like you see here of the Dome of the Rock in 1908. And then maybe several months before he passes away, he does this painting of Moses. Do you want to say something about this, Miriam, before we close?
Yes, this is definitely, again, one of discoveries, an unknown painting that was on an auction, and we received information about it just by chance. And it summarizes in many ways Hirszenberg's work. And I put it for the last, actually, in this talk about Palestine, where he lived very shortly and, as we already mentioned, died in 1908. Because Moses is here shown in front, holding his hands up, where, as from Jesus' stigmata, wounds on his palms that we see dark here, protrudes a sand, and also his arms are reminiscent of a crucifix. So in a way, he creates here a overlap, a mixture of two characters important for Jews at that time, both new attitude towards Christianity in Jesus and Moses at the same time. But Moses, who didn't really come to the Holy Land, whom we see in the background, are people of Israel that are portrayed here once again as exiles in the same procession, walking through desert here, but reminiscent of his painting Exile. So in a way, he's summing up here different thoughts and ideas that we saw he developed during his lifetime and during his different periods and stages of artistic development.
Let me just finish with the last sentence that we have in our book. By merging Moses and Jesus in this manner, was he presenting his final symbolic and prophetic vision that only their combined struggles and suffering could bring the people out of Egypt, out of bondage, to begin a new form of Jewish life in its historic land? That is a question which we did not answer, but we left. For those of you who will get to the end of this book, will have an opportunity to think of this yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we can stop sharing here, right? And we're ready for questions.
Sarah?
Hello. Yes, thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating talk. And I'm sorry that you had to rush at the end. There are obviously so many things we could go back to. I'm going to start with the chat and with some of the comments there, and then there's a couple of things I will raise with you also. So I think we'll perhaps go in reverse, because the later comments refer to the works you've lately had on the screen. I think if we start with Yona and Alfred, they were referring to the last picture that you showed, the Moses, and the comment was that this looks apocalyptic, with Moses holding rocks and the people fleeing, and they ask, why Jesus? So I guess they're asking why you're invoking Jesus. Who would like to answer there?
Do you want to answer?
Well, I think that in a way Hirszenberg may be bringing together his own personal life in this moment as well. Let us remember that he was married to a convert who was very deeply associated to his world, and yet I would maybe even bring this back to The Last Jew, the painting that we saw from 1897. Hirszenberg was clearly thinking of a different world. If his attraction to Spinoza, his attraction to a very modern world, a very different world from where he came from. So maybe at this moment in his life, where he's thinking of how this process evolved, leaving Egypt, coming into the New World, maybe he is thinking of this connection between Judaism and Christianity. Miriam, what do you think?
Yeah, I would maybe add, or I'm just thinking about Gottlieb again, because Maurizio Gottlieb was very much involved with the image of Jewish Jesus preaching in Capernaum to all three religions. So the subject of Jesus presented in a new light was present among Jewish artists, also before Hirszenberg and at the time of Hirszenberg. So he, I think, incorporated this dialogue, this discourse between Judaism and Christianity exactly at the time when he arrived to Holy Land, to Eretz Israel, and tried to sort of put together his artistic life and his life with Dina as a former Christian woman who converted, and Jerusalem, that was also city important for all three religions, not just Jews. So I think all these different approaches and thoughts were present in at that time. And as Dina described him, he was like extremely excited. He was like running through the old city, experiencing the environment, painting all the time the Temple Mount. So of course he was thinking about all these different aspects in Christianity that he came from, lived with, grew up in a land that was Catholic, and had the first-hand experience with the Christianity before coming to Jerusalem, to Eretz Israel. So of course that these thoughts were then present, and I think he put them together in this last painting.
Thank you. So there's quite a few comments and questions here. So I'm just going to go up in reverse order. So Anna asks whether Hirszenberg was influenced by Herzl.
No. Very clearly, no. There's no sign that he actually became a Zionist, okay? We don't know if he was planning to remain in Jerusalem. He goes to Jerusalem. He maybe is thinking of another kind of world that he wants to encounter. But he, like other artists of Jewish origin who come to Bezalel in the first years of Bezalel, don't always remain there. So I would say that Herzl is not important to him. He doesn't in any way try to create his image in any of his works. So I would basically say I would be negative on that question.
Okay, so moving on then, Joyce asks, how do we know that the great Spinoza painting ended up in Russia?
Go ahead, Miriam. You remember the story.
Okay. So the painting was actually bought by one of the Jewish Russian collectors in Moscow, in not after soon after Hirszenberg painted it. And it seems that Leonid Pasternak, who was befriended with Hirszenberg still from Munich days, was a contact that enabled this purchase. After the revolution, October Revolution of 1917, the collection was nationalized, was stolen basically, and dispersed. And good part of that collection ended up in the city of Kursk, which is still there today, not far from Moscow. And it was actually in the collection of the National Museum since early 30s, 1930s, and it's still there today. So we also came just by chance through connections and friends who managed to find the painting there, and we ordered the color photograph. That was actually the first color photograph that anybody ever saw of that painting, because the painting was always known through its black and white reproductions, and we were the first one who got the color image, color
Very
photograph.
exciting.
Yeah.
And just add an addendum to that. Do we know which the collector was, the private collector?
Well, I can't
Or
remember.
you can't say.
I cannot remember the name. I'm sorry.
Fine, of course. So
It's not among the famous ones. It's not. It's definitely not. It's a Jewish collector, but as I said, I cannot remember the name right now.
okay. So Tina comments on loving the light in the dome of the rock. I was also really struck by that beautiful exposure to the outside. And she asks whether he created any other similar to this in his work.
There's a whole series of such paintings of Dome of the Rock, and they're all very much enchanted by the light and the sky and the blue and the yellow. And this actually, he goes back to his impressionist short period in Paris. Once he came, he experienced this encounter with light very strongly, and the colors are becoming again very brilliant and strong. As we saw, he experimented with them already in Paris.
So I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to speed up here. So Gail, thanks you for the very interesting talk. She's asking whether there are any paintings by Hirszenberg in this country. So Gail, I would say there is the Ben-Uri painting, but I will let the experts answer the rest of the question.
I think you even have another painting of his. Not only one of the landscapes is in Ben Uri as well.
We just have that Sabbath rest now, but we do have a landscape by his brother. I think that's correct. Or did you reassign that landscape?
Yeah, you had one winter landscape, but I think the Lodge City Museum bought it.
It's in the City Museum because it was such a
but you do have one symbolist painting that is maybe connected to this cycle of Poznański Palace and the paintings that he did at that time. There is one symbolist painting with a woman with a big earring, sort of
yes.
oriental. Yeah.
You know, one of the nice things about following an artist is that it makes you go to many different places in the world. And so we wouldn't want, even if Ben-Uri wanted to have all the Hirszenberg paintings, it would be somewhat disappointing for us, because this way we had to go to Poland, we had to go to Switzerland, we had to go to Paris, we had to go to London, and we had to go to New York. And we didn't go out to the West Coast, but we do know that there was another work there.
Oh, wow. Well, we certainly absolutely adore the one that we have. And just to end with that one, Jonna asks, I believe I know the answer to this, but I'm going to hand over to the experts again. Is this a sick child in the bed? And she notes that that was a frequent theme at this time, notably in the work of Edvard Munch. Richard or Miriam, would you like?
Yeah. I'm not sure. You're talking about the Sabbath rest, right?
Yes, the figure in the bed.
I'm not really sure. I always thought it's an old woman, but there is another the earlier version, right? Am I now mixing it up? I think there is one painting that shows a younger woman, and then the last.
Yes, the earlier one has a younger woman. Yes.
Right, and the last version is the one that you have is I think, old woman, not a child.
She's not an old woman. She's, I
Okay,
mean,
elder,
she's
elder.
maybe one of the daughters of her, of the
Okay.
parents.
I think we always thought she was the matriarch, but she's the one in the bed. But you're saying she's a younger woman as well.
No, in one version, it's in the
Uh-huh.
big one that you have. I think it's he changed it, and it's
Uh-huh.
like
Okay.
kerchief
Okay,
over the
right.
head, and you don't see the hair. So
Yeah.
it's hard to say if it's really young, but it's not a child.
And everyone has commented on what a fascinating, brilliant and interesting talk it's been, of which I absolutely concur. So I'd like to thank you both very much for the wonderful talk. Also to mention our colleague Reka for the smooth running behind the scenes and banishing the gremlins which threatened us at the start. And I'd like to thank everyone in our virtual audience, and to say, please do look out for the recording of this event, which will be released to you shortly. We look forward to welcoming you in person at our exhibition, Shaping the Future, at the gallery until the 2nd of June. And please do look out for more wonderful talks like this one in our talk section online. So thank you, Miriam and Richard, and a well-earned rest this evening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much. And good evening to all of you.
Thank you and goodbye.